Sweden, got his PhD from Berkeley, and then before joining Harvard, he worked at digital research. Today, Michael is going to talk about very nice work that was published in the Science magazine, which is about detecting novel associations in large data sets. Please welcome with me Michael Mr.
So before I get to the talk, since I'm on the East Coast and not normally part of the machine learning, or don't normally talk to necessarily machine learning people, I did just want to give a brief introduction to myself. So my actual main focus of research tends to be on algorithms, like randomized algorithms, things like networks or search engines or other sorts of very big data type systems. As you mentioned, I have the pleasure of writing a book on randomized algorithms with Holly Upfall. My research.
People hear me? Did I start over again? My research has spanned a lot of things over the years. So recently I've done some stuff related to analysis of the Groupon and Yelp data that we collected, looking at sort of internet e-commerce ecosystems, verification systems for cloud computing, oblivious RAM simulation, hash-based data structures, which has sort of been a main area of my work. In the past, I've looked at things like power laws, how they come about, low density parity check codes, compression, and again, lots of time, going all the way back from my thesis on hash-based data structures. And so if you want to talk about any of these things afterwards, I'd be happy if you, any of these things sound interesting to you, if you want to come up and talk about them. Just because it was also something new and was in the news and it was fun to talk about, because that way, even if you don't get anything out of the rest of my talk, you might get something out of this. We had done some analysis we're trying to figure out how Groupon worked or what its business model was or what its implications were. So we ended up looking at a big data set, collecting data from Groupon and Yelp. And the goal was we were using Yelp as sort of a proxy as to what was Groupon doing for businesses, instead of like the social science approach of trying to hand out thousands of surveys to businesses and getting information back. We were much too lazy for that, so we decided to figure out some sort of useful proxy and came up with Yelp reviews. And what you see is sort of this interesting effect that when you run a Groupon, when a business runs a Groupon, you can see that on average the number of reviews actually goes up substantially, but the average score also goes down substantially, so that in fact bringing in more business, but they might be hurting your longer term reputation. And in a recent follow-up paper, we looked again at the data and we're examining various reasons or hypotheses people had for why that might be. So that's some actual practical big data analysis type stuff I've done. What I'm going to be talking about today is an approach for looking at big data sets, which most of the work I'll give credit to David and Yakir Reshef, who just happen to be brothers, who sort of came up with this formulation of the goal of what it was we were trying to do. So I'll move on to talk about that. But the key for this sort of introduction is to point out that I'm not really a machine learning person. I'm not even really a statistics person. So when I use the wrong language or don't sound right to you, or use the wrong terminology, hope you'll give me some slack and forgive me. In particular, I understand that I sort of borrowed the slides straight from David and Yakir, and so any faults in the slides or anything are really their fault and not mine at all. And so if we all understand that from the beginning, we'll go much smoother. Okay, so way of introducing this talk is, how are we figuring out how we evolve to cope with big data sets? What exactly have we been missing? And so this is Yakir, who one of the students who made the slide. And when I say big data, I'm not necessarily talking about lots of data points here, although you may have data sets with in particular lots of data points. But we were thinking in terms of large in the sense of having lots and lots of dimensions. So you have a number of possible dimensions that you're looking at, and you're trying to figure out, which of these dimensions are related to each other, how are they associated with each other, what are the correlations right here that might be most important. So you can just think of having a big table among your variables. You're trying to say, okay, well, what's actually interesting here? Okay. So our point of view is that we're looking from the point of view of exploration. Right? You've sort of got your data set, and you want to start thinking about generating some sort of hypotheses that you may go look at. You may require more data to examine in the future, but just trying to figure out where, now that you've got this big data set, where in lies the interesting stuff that you need to examine further. Okay, so natural way to look at it is you say, okay, I'll have some notion, a measure of dependence, and I'll look at each of the pairs of variables, and I'll try and rank those scores and look at the ones that are most important. And the problem here is that, well, what do you mean by a relationship? What measure of dependence do we care about, right? So there are all sorts of different relationships which may be interesting. And again, if you're just sort of building up a new data set and looking to explore, you might not have any sort of inclination as to which patterns are most important to you. Right? A natural thing you might do is to say, well, I want to look for linear patterns. But linear patterns aren't the only sorts of patterns. And so if you use a sort of linear coefficient test, right, if you look for linear relationships, you're not going to find a bunch of other sorts of patterns. Right? You're going to find sort of periodic patterns or parabolic patterns, and you'll have weaker scores for other sorts of patterns, that like monotonic relationships, which might look kind of linear, but not really. All right, so one issue is just there's lots of possible patterns you might be looking for. You might not know what to look for. And of course, the other big problem is in the real world, data are noisy. So what is it, how do you take into account? The pattern you're looking for isn't going to be that nice, pristine looking type pattern that we've been looking at up here. It will be sort of sample from a function, say. All right, so sort of at the very high level, and if there's, again, something to take away from the talk, this might be just the most important thing to take for a talk, is that the way we ended up, after many iterations, framing what it is we were looking for, is that what we want is a score that should be able to detect a large range of relationship types, right? So ideally, on random noise, we should be able to assign a score of 0 or something close to it. And for a wide range of relationships, including things like linear relationships, but other functional type relationships, monotonic relationships, functional relationships, including periodic type relationships, or even things that are a small number of superpositions of multiple functional relationships. We'd like to be able to detect those, that is, we'd like to be able to give those a very strong score of 1 or close to 1, and random things a score of 0. But we want something more than that. That takes into account the notion that we want to detect many patterns. But again, the other aspect is we want to sort of detect them fairly, right? We want to deal with the issue of noise. And so our notion of dealing with noise is what we call equitability, right? So that relationships with similar noise levels should receive similar scores, right? So ideally a 0.8 for a line or something close to a line, and a 0.8 for something close to this reflects the same amount of noise. And the reason we want this is, again, we don't have any a priori notion of what patterns are necessarily important or that we might be looking for. Okay? And so if you don't have this notion of equitability, right, if you have a scoring system, you can have a scoring system that might be close to 1 on various patterns and close to 0 on noise, right? But if it doesn't sort of degrade equally with noise for different patterns, then you're going to be biased when you're exploring this large search space. Like if you tend to have scores that are higher for linear relationships, And when you say, okay, let me look at all the relationships, I'll score all the relationships, sort the scores. Be biased towards certain types of relationships, and you may never get to these other interesting relationships because they'll just naturally fall farther down the list. All right, so as I'm sure you're aware, there are lots and lots of methods that already exist for measuring some sort of score on a data set, to measure the strength of a relationship. And generally when we look at them, what we find is that the tests that we know of tend to fit into one or the other of the categories, but not both. So either you get something that's general, that is good at detecting lots of different patterns, and for there, things like mutual information, sort of a natural approach. And there are others that you can think of as variations on mutual information or other sorts of related approaches. And you can find things that are equitable, right, that sort of degrade similarly with respect to noise, but are only good at finding certain specific types of patterns, right? The most natural being the Pearson correlation coefficient, which is, of course, really good at finding linear relationships, but not so good at finding any other sort of relationship you might care about. And so, sort of the question that came up, again, that came up with, and again, sort of started again by these students, was this question of, can we find something that gives us some of both? And their motivation was they were working in the systems biology side of things. This work is, as I'll point out at the end, sort of a combination of a lot of people's work. And they were working from the systems biology end, and they were looking at this issue of, gee, we have all these data sets that we might want to look at. How can we actually figure out if there's something meaningful in here that we can use to generate hypotheses to explore the data sets in this way? Okay, so now I'm going to get into describing sort of the main aspects of our solution. And the technique we're going to use is a technique that's been used in other sorts of statistical tests before. So I think we're using it in a slightly different way. And it's based on gridding, right? So we have our data points. And you can say, well, what I'm going to do is overlay a grid on this set of data points, and that will induce, instead of thinking of the actual data points at that point, I can just think of it in terms of being a distribution on the actual grid squares, right? How many points fall into each position in the grid. Okay, and here I've done this in an equipartition grid. I've divided the space up evenly. Okay. And of course, then the question becomes, well, how should I create the grid, right? Equipartitioning is just one way to make the grid, but is that really necessarily the most informative way I can make the grid? Right? Different grids are going to behave differently. Sorry, this is showing up a little dark, but here you sort of see this line, and you sort of look at it, the natural way of gridding the line is sort of breaking it up so that you only have these two pieces as opposed to breaking up in this equipartition square, where all of a sudden you have three pieces, sort of it's a less adequate, good description of the line. And you can see the same sort of thing here for the parabola, natural sort of breaking point. If you're breaking into a 3x2 grid, has only 3 non-empty components. And what is it our sort of high-level idea is that if there's a pattern, there should be some sort of grid that captures the notion of what that pattern is. If there's some sort of relationship, we want there to be a grid that captures it. And so more formally, could we formalize this notion of what does it mean to capture the pattern, or how can we score that? Okay. And what we mean in terms of capturing it is we can turn it into an information theoretic sort of statement. And I'm not going to go into a lecture on information theory. If you've seen it before, then this will have some strict meaning for you. And if you don't, then I think the intuitive level meaning is sort of fine. It's just that you sort of want to collapse the distribution so that you can predict, if someone tells you, hey, I'm looking for a point that's somewhere in here, can you tell me how likely it is to in each of these things, that someone can give you a very good guess. So here in this case, you could say if someone told you I'm looking for a data point here, you could tell them exactly that it's going to be in this grid square, not this grid square. So what you're looking for is that the mutual information on the grid, restricted to the gridding that you've done, is high. That is, if someone gives you an x coordinate, you can predict which grid blocks it's in on the y coordinate as well as possible. Okay. So this leads us to our scoring methodology, or scoring parameter, that we call the maximal information coefficient. So the point is that, and this is one of the aspects of our approach, our system, is we're not going to look at just one grid, but we'll look at multiple grid resolutions. Right, and then once we look at the grid resolutions, we're going to try and find what's the right gridding based on that. Where should we have our splitting points? And for different resolutions, we'll come up with different grids with different scores of mutual information. And ideally, we'll pick out the best one. Now, I should point out that obviously finding the best grid can be a computationally expensive operation. Right now, I'm just describing the maximal information coefficient in its idealized form, and I'll talk about the computational aspects of it subsequently. But right now, think of it as just, ideally, what would you like to be able to do? Say, well, for each grid resolution, I'll find the best one. And then, the quality for each grid is, as I mentioned, going to correspond to this mutual information. So we're trying to find the grid that maximizes this quantity, okay, for each separate grid resolution. And then what do we do to take into account these different grid resolutions? So a nice way to think of it is, instead of thinking of just having one score, we're going to have a whole matrix of scores. One for each grid resolution size. And we're going to normalize according to essentially the dimensions of the grid. Right? So the more, obviously, the sort of more you can split up the grid into pieces, the higher your mutual information score should be. You should be able to obtain. Right? The better your prediction should be able to be. So to take into account, and if you think in information theoretic terms, the right thing to scale by is sort of the log of grid size, and to scale things so that they fall between 0 and 1, we scale by log of the minimum of the x and y. The mutual information is at most log of the minimum of x and y. So when I talk about the maximal information coefficient, and I talk specifically about MID or MAC, what we're doing is what we needed to do is pick the highest value within this matrix. And in some sense, that's supposed to capture how much pattern there is, how much there is in this actual relationship, with 1 being a perfect pattern, and ideally 0 being random noise. All right, so there are some practical concerns. One thing that you might think of immediately is like, well, look, if you only have n points, right? If I split this into an n by n grid, I should be able to stick, every data point, as long as they're not like right on top of each other, right next to each other, vertically or horizontally. I should be able to stick each data point into its own cell. So in that case, right, the mutual information really is 1, right? So why is this at all meaningful? And so so if you allow too many grids, you'll get overfitting, and if you restrict the things that are too small grids, you'll get underfitting. So the right thing is sort of just to say, well, look, we're going to bound the number of cells that you can actually have to something meaningful, right? So this is a parameter of the system, and a parameter of the calculation. Generally, we take the even to be something like into the 0.6 or into the 0.7. That seems to work well in terms of computationally and in terms of avoiding this issue of overfitting things too much. So once we define this, what are the sorts of things you'd like to know about it, or what are the things you'd like to state about it? And some of what we've done is actually look and try and formally prove things about this coefficient. Right? Does it actually have properties that you'd like it to have in a meaningful sense? Okay, so so the first thing that we can prove is that if I have some sort of noiseless functional relationship, right? So if my data corresponded to an actual function, and I just sample points from that function, as I sample more points, the MIC mix will converge to 1. So it's saying that if your underlying data is generated by a real functional relationship, then as you gather enough data, you'll see that and you'll get the right sort of thing, a 1 representing that there is some sort of relationship there. Similarly, if you have a constant number of superpositions of never constant noiseless functional relationships, it will also tend to 1. And this is sort of an interesting property because, as I'll show when we look at data sets, my claim is that this is sort of a very useful property to have, right? That sometimes when you're looking at a data set, what's going on is that you're actually looking at sort of 2 patterns at once, and that sort of thing will mess up most of the standard tests you can think about, right? If you have, it's one thing to say I'm using Pearson to look for linear relationships, but what if you have 2 superimposed linear relationships? Pearson's not going to necessarily really understand that. And one of the benefits of ours is that our system really does seem to understand it, and this is something that, as far as we can tell, many other related tests of this type don't actually have. And of course, the other thing that you'd like is that random stuff really goes to 0, right? That you're not going to think of random data as having a pattern, right? Because that'll create a large number of false positives that you'll have to go through when you're doing your exploration of the data set. Okay. All right. So, what sort of relationships does Nick find? Right? And so here we're comparing with a bunch of other different sorts of tests, different other sort of scoring rules. And the goal here is obviously that random should be 0 or close to 0. And what we did here is we took various sorts of relationships and just sampled points from that. I think this was something like 1,000 data points. And what you can see, right, in terms of generality, right, this is sort of going from weakest to strongest. It's like, Pearson's really good if you want to find linear relationships. If you start looking for other things, you're just not going to find them. And as we go through for more and more complicated tests, we're sort of getting better. And maximal correlation is actually a very complicated test that does reasonably well. And Nick, of course, does very well. So once you get to enough data points, everything after you round it gets to 1, and random is still very, very small. Okay, so that, and again, I want to separate out these sort of 2 key ideas about what it is we're looking for. This is generality, right? This says we can detect things. This says scores go to 1. But this is for noiseless functional relationships, right? This is just sort of saying, okay, I've put together my list of toy relationships, I've sampled points, and look, my system can detect it. But now what happens when I start to add in noise? And again, remember, what we're looking at when we try and add in noise is this notion of equitability. So this is sort of a graph of sort of like all the different sort of patterns that we want. And this is using, not ours, this is using a different test, one that people talk about a lot when discussing alternatives to our approach, namely just using mutual information. And so, again, each color here sort of represents a different functional relationship as we add different amounts of noise. Right? When you get to a score of 1, you expect your scores to be 0, right? Because at that point, it's supposed to look like a waving cloud. And here, the noise that we're adding, by the way, is vertical distance. All right, so the point is that we say, okay, look, what we want is that scores are comparable, right? So you can have different relationships, and if you get the same score, it should correspond to the same amount of noise. And what we see is that if you just look at sort of pure mutual information, that's not the case, right? So, a score of a mutual information score of 1 gives you sort of a sine wave corresponds to a sine wave with very, very little noise, but corresponds to a linear relationship with lots of noise. Same thing here. Here's looking at sine wave versus a parabola, down at a mutual information score of 0.5. Right. So this point of equitability is that for this sort of test, as we showed on the last slide, part of the problem is it's not general, but it's also not necessarily equitable as well. And again, we looked at all sorts of different relationships, and again, what you can sort of see is that they're all over the place. Okay, so what you get when you look at MIC is what you want. You have a fairly tight band within the relationships, right? That no matter what relationship is, it corresponds, the certain amount of noise corresponds to roughly the same MIC value, right? So looking at this point here, the amount of noise for the sort of, some point exponentially type growing relationship looks to be close to the same amount of noise for this linear relationship. The sine wave looks close to this parabola, and so the amount of noise corresponding to the score. Yeah?
Why is it that it doesn't seem to go quite to 0?
So eventually it will converge to 0, but it has to be for sort of large data type data sizes, bigger than what we were looking at here. So MIC does converge to 0 as the noise goes up for big enough relationships, or for big enough data sets. But not when the data set is some finite size. So this is an issue with MIC is that it doesn't go to 0 as fast as some other tests. But on the other hand, since our goal is to sort of find interesting relationships that we want to look at and avoid the less interesting relationships, that hasn't been a problem in terms of using it for data exploration and analysis. Yeah?
I have no idea if it would matter, but trying to simply just add a noise by adding vertical. Try other kind of distribution.
Absolutely. So I'm just showing the vertical, but we've done different tests where you add noise in both the x and y coordinates and so on. And MIC is actually robust as far as we can tell, regardless of what type of noise that you see. The dimensions of this band may vary a little bit, but you get the same sort of banding effect. Whereas actually several of the other tests are a lot more sensitive as to whether you're adding noise in the x direction or the y direction. Right, because, in some sense, the noise could be in the y direction corresponding to your measurement, but it could also be in the x direction corresponding to the value you thought you were measuring isn't exactly the value you thought you were measuring either. So you do sort of expect that there will be noise in real-world situations, potentially in both dimensions, and you can retest it to that. You get the same sort of effect. Right, so and we get this equitability even for other sorts of relationships. So here we're sort of showing what's the, as we increase the noise, relationships that have essentially the same MIC values. You can see they're, to us at least, they seem pretty sensible in terms of what it's doing. so again, as sort of an example, here's another sort of test that people have used for this sort of thing in the past, a smoothing spline, and you can sort of see the bias in favor of linear relationships, right? Linear relationships get higher scores, even with big amounts of noise. And these other relationships, in particular, these two lines or these sort of superposition relationships that we talked about are particularly bad. Whereas for MIC, you get a picture which we think looks a lot more reasonable, regardless of what type of relations you get. The noise and the scores line up much more clearly. Now, another thing that comes out of this, is that MIC is sort of the main parameter that we were looking at. Right? But there are other things that come out of this process. Right? That you're not just getting the single score. MIC is derived from this matrix that you're calculating, from doing all these different grids, and you can use that information. Right? So one way of visualizing it is you can actually think of the characteristic matrix as being sort of graphed as a three-dimensional surface, rows and columns versus score. And the point is that different types of curves may have different sorts of patterns, different sorts of behaviors. Different functional relationships will actually look different in how they behave when you look at it in this three-dimensional type space. What we said was response to MIC is just really the peak of the surface. What's the highest value you achieve? Right, but there's other information embedded here from the different patterns, right? So a line corresponds to a very flat top surface. Parabola has this sort of feature. A circle is actually sort of going the other way. The score goes up as the green goes up. And the point is that what we found, and I'm not going to get into too much detail about this here, but you can look at it in the paper, is that you can use these other properties of the characteristic matrix to further describe the sorts of things that you're seeing in your pattern. So properties like complexity. By complexity, we mean things like how many different functions might be superimposed in the data. Monotonicity, does it look like a monotonically increasing or decreasing relationship? We can look for things like nonlinearity. Right, so one of the things you can do is instead of trying to sort your scores by MIC, you can come up with a nonlinearity score, which sort of says, find me the relationships that I wouldn't have already found by running Pearson's test. You can use Pearson's test to find the linear relationships, and then use our nonlinearity score to say, okay, now let me find the other stuff that's more interesting that I might have missed. Okay, so an example is the maximum asymmetry score. So that's sort of saying, how does the grid, when we look at 2 by 4, differ from how we're looking at it when it's 4 by 2? Right? So we look at those pairs, 2, 4, 4, 2, 2, 5, 5, 2, 3, 5, 5, 3, and so on. And the point is that as the relationship becomes less monotonic, the characteristic matrix becomes less symmetric. Right? So you get bigger and bigger asymmetry scores, bigger and bigger maximum asymmetry scores, so the less monotonic it is. Right, you can sort of see the change as you sort of cross this XY axis. All right, so by using this score, you can assign essentially a sort of monotonicity score as well, which may also be useful in terms of helping you classify the relationships as you're trying to explore them in your data. All right, so again, in the paper we talk about these other sorts of scores and how they might be useful. And so I should say our goal in the science paper was less to find new relationships, right, but to sort of say, look, we're coming up with this new sort of statistic. What might it be good for, and how good is it at capturing relationships? So one of the things we did is we wanted to look at a variety of different types of data sets and see, what we could find. And in particular, one of the things we were looking at was data sets that were actually known, where there were patterns that had been found, usually with a lot more work than we claim that you could find them by using ours, to test if our approach could be used to find these sorts of relationships, knowing that they were actually in there. But even with that, we often found significant surprises. So we looked at this World Health Organization data set with different indicators, a few hundred countries, a few hundred variables per country. So we were talking about not necessarily a huge data set, but a data set with a fairly large number of relationships, pairs of relationships to look at. And so then we started just looking around for interesting things. And so one of the interesting things we found is this chart, which looked at the axes related to the amount of income per person in the country related to adult obesity. And there's sort of a mainline trend, right? But this red line is something we added after the fact, after we looked and found the pattern. We claim that there's sort of two trends going on here. One is this sort of what we might call the mainline trend with most of the data points, which follows a sort of natural pattern. Does anyone want to, explain what that sort of mainline health pattern is?
Salads.
What?
When salads, that's the big sin. When income goes above a certain level, it's the amount of food doesn't change at all, and it's not the amount of meat doesn't increase, but the amount of salad increases. Until that point, it's the amount of meat that's increasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, or you're familiar in ways of meat. The way I might put it in terms of maybe good food versus bad food, right?
20,000 is pretty high for just not enough food or low food. Because that's meat still.
Okay. So up to a certain point, the more money you have, the heavier people are, because they're just able to purchase more food, right? And the limiting factor at the low end is they don't have enough money to buy food. The more money they have, they can actually buy food. Except past the point, once you get to a certain amount of income per person, then things like dieting and avoiding the bad foods, and so really rich countries, people tend to be thinner, right? Because they can actually pay more for certain qualities or types of food. And this is the mainline trend, but as you can see, there's sort of a second superposition pattern here, and this is the sort of thing that other tests would have a lot of difficulty finding, because it's a superposition of two sort of disjoint, distinct relationships. Anyone have any guess what this line corresponds to?
Some places in Africa where beef fat is considered rich, and like if you're thin, you're considered poor. So they're trying to show that they're rich.
Yeah. So particularly most of these points correspond to the Polynesian islands, right? Where sort of culturally, a way of demonstrating wealth or well-being corresponds to a size factor. And so, this is a relationship that, makes a lot of sense. This is not a new relationship that we've discovered, right? This was sort of known or understood before. But the point is that our system was very easily able to pull it out. This was one of the higher ranked relationships. Whereas other systems would have trouble with this sort of relationship precisely because it's the superposition of two different things. So this is again the WHO data set. This is sort of and this corresponds to looking for things that are or this is sort of a heat map, which among other things shows you how we can look for things that are nonlinear. Right. So if we look at relationships like D here, right, which has a fairly high mixed score, but a similarly high Pearson correlation coefficient, albeit in the negative direction, right? You see that corresponds to a pretty linear type relationship. Right? So when the mixed score and the Pearson score are about the same, right? Or when it's a linear relationship, you expect that the mixed score and the Pearson score will be about the same. So when you look at the the difference of them in absolute value, you should get a 0. On the other hand, if you get to some of these more interesting points where you can have high mixed score but low correlation coefficient, then you get these sort of nonlinear patterns, right? So here you've got this pattern where there's sort of two patterns going on here, sort of vertical and horizontal, might correspond to two different types. You've got the superposition that we noted. Here you just have sort of a nonlinear relationship. Yeah.
Are you able to uniquely identify these red lines from the MIC groups?
No. So
The red lines are not part of the MIC. That's just like after the fact. Let's find the best fitting curve. Right. So that's a subsequent step. Right. That's just for helping us visualize it for the talk. That's not part of MIC itself. MIC will sort of pull out the chart, and then once you've pulled out, said, oh, this is interesting, let's do things like find the best fitting curve or best fitting line.
Can it tell you maybe how many superposed curves you have?
Yeah, so that's the complexity measure. Will give you an idea of how many different superpositions there might be. Yeah.
Can you quickly explain why in graph H, let's say, suppose high for both Pearson and also MIC, even though you have two different?
So why it scored, the question was, why is this relationship score high for both Pearson and MIC, even though it's two relationships? And the issue is that the vast majority of the data points are actually falling on this relationship, which is nearly linear. So Pearson is essentially treating this small number of data points as noise and getting away with it because it's a smaller number of data points, so it still has a fairly high Pearson coefficient. Yeah.
So all these analyses are two-dimensional.
Yeah.
And you early on said, the problems you're looking at have very high dimensionality. Does this mean you're just taking your large dimensionality and just picking the paired dimensions of time to do analysis?
Yes, and I'll have something towards the end to show how you might cope with trying to find larger sorts of groups of systems of correlations. That could be interesting. But yes, the actual test is just working on pairs of relationships.
This extends naturally to multiple dimensions also, right?
Say again?
If you wanted to measure relationships between three variables, instead of gridding the rectangle that you had, now you can grid a cube.
You can grid a cube. It's not, mathematically, it's less clear that it does the right thing. So there are some funny examples. You can come up with things like spirals that maybe are, we should take that offline. It's not clear that the benefits of MIC extend to 3 dimensions in all cases.
Plus there's also the curve of dimensionality, you need more data.
Exactly, right. Then it also just becomes harder. There's many more options for gridding, so there's complexity issues as well. Oh, okay. Sorry, so again, the point is that in terms of nonlinear type relationships, right, this is sort of the interesting space. This is the space of high MIC scores and lower Pearson correlation coefficient scores. And sort of by looking in that space for relationships, we can attempt to find sort of the interesting nonlinear relationships. Sort of an aspect, again, of the issue of non-equitable behavior is, again, looking at mutual information. Is that mutual information, the scale is a bit different, but mutual information tends to track linear relationships much more closely. So there's a bias for mutual information towards linear relationships. Right, so again, when we were doing the comparison, looking at mutual information on this data set, most of what it found, or a good chunk of what it found, would be linear, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case with MIC. So MIC is adding something new to this, since linear relationships are easy to find and are well understood. Here we're sort of looking at specific relationships, again, looking at this issue of equitability. So here are cases where we have mutual information that is supposed to be about the same, and MIC scores which are supposed to be about the same. And the point is that the claim is that if you look at these, somehow that MIC's doing more the right thing in terms of dealing with the noise, right? It's giving similar scores to relationships that appear to have the same amount of noise. mutual information gives us similar scores to relationships that have different noise, while MIC gives similar scores to relationships that seem to have about the same noise. Okay. So another place that we were looking for interesting relationship was looking at genes, and in particular looking at sort of gene expression, looking at them as a time series, trying to find periodic relationships. So the original work with this was done by other groups, Bellman et al. In 1988, and we thank them for their data set. And here the idea is, if we're looking for or periodic type relationships, one way to look for them is to look for non-monotonicity, right, which corresponds to the MAS score, right? So by looking for things that have high MIC, and then we can look for things that also have high mass, which means that they'll have high non-monotonicity. We can look for oscillating type relationships. Right, so sort of going up the chain, C is pretty much monotonic, D is, it's a little gap, but it's not. And as we keep going up, we get more and more up and down type relationships. So this is a useful tool for screening, for looking for example, for periodic type relationships that you might be looking for in time series. We looked at another data set, looking at the human gut microbiome. Here, what we're really looking at is looking at different types of bacteria in your stomach, right, and seeing how the quantities relate. When you see this, does the amount of these different types of bacteria relate? And here we have what appears to be, right, the claim is that this is a superposition of two different relationships, which is something that MIC finds well when we came out high in terms of the MIC score, right? We have a relationship here and a relationship here. And then after the fact, we sort of went back and looked and tried to say, well, where did this come from? And labeling, sort of the data points, what we found is that these red points correspond to one type of diet, and the blue points correspond to another type of diet. Right? So we really, and this is a case where we're actually able to verify, yes, the reason we see data like this is because it comes from essentially two different types of data, two different relationships in the data. And the point is that these bacteria are, this is a fairly natural relationship to look at. It corresponds to bacteria that compete with each other. Right? You'll tend to have high on one means you'll have low on the other. Right? High quantities of one means low quantity of the other. And so it's natural that diet might be something that affects that or causes that. Right? And the point is that we were looking at, we found different relationships of this type, and we're able to go back and look at the data and say, well, what caused this sort of competition type relationship, or what was it affected by? And they could be affected by different sorts of parameters. And again, the idea here is this is a tool for exploration, right? So the idea is you say, hey, look, I found an interesting relationship. It seems to be that we have potentially some sort of competition here. Then you have to go back and do the science and look back and say, what are the factors that might have been causing this? Right? So again, the point of this is not to answer that question. The point of this is not necessarily say, oh yeah, this is caused by diet, but it's to point out to you that, hey, there's an interesting relationship. You should go back, look at the data, see if you can figure out what the cause is, what the confounding variable is, what's causing this sort of relationship.
So what exactly are you showing on this chart?
So these are for different types of bacteria, sort of their concentration in the gut.
Each of these meta variables, what does each plot, how does it differ?
So what we've done is that each of the, it may be a bit hard to see, I know the color isn't coming out so well, but like a bunch of these points are blue and a bunch of these points are red, right? And the point is that, the idea is what's the explanation for why we have this when you have high in this direction, you have low in this direction, and it, looking at the different sort of possible side variables, it seems that sex is the possible explanation.
So
Right?
in
The
that
red
plot,
points are here.
so in that plot is the color then set
Yes.
corresponding sex,
Sex.
and then in that other chart then
It corresponded to two
two
different types of diets.
Okay. Sorry, I was trying to figure out.
No problem. Good question. So we also looked at baseball data because the surest way to get a paper into science is to look at something useful like baseball data. And there's an important baseball stat. Turns out to be not like number of hits or even your batting percentage, but sort of this composite measure developed by the statisticians known as RPMLV. And so one of the things we were looking at is things like what players were paid versus their RPMLV, and we actually found that it was a good statistic. The sense that the teams that had you sort of compared the players' RPMLV to what their salary was, and you could look and say if they were overpaid or underpaid, and the teams that had sort of the players that were getting sort of the best bang for their buck, tended to make the playoffs. I think this is 2011 data. The Yankees didn't, and sort of look at all the other teams in between. But in some sense, again, other statisticians had found that this RPMLV was a very good statistic for capturing sort of what an actual player value is. Right? It's a combination of how often you get on base, as well as other statistics. And so we weren't inventing that by any means, but we were looking at this data set, and lo and behold, our analysis sort of gave the right picture, sort of pulled out the right sort of information in a natural way. So we got to this issue of what do we do if there's sort of more than two, if you want to look for relationships involving more than two. So we've built sort of a visualization framework on top of this, where the idea is, what you can do is edges correspond to relationships, and you can think of the strength of an edge, as corresponding to the actual score, right? And then you can sort of try and cluster a graph of various things based on what their scores actually are, right? So if you look at this for things like the World Health Organization data set, you sort of see some natural clusters, right? Adult literacy, male and female, of course, very tightly clustered with literacy for others. Maybe you can see CO2 emissions closely tied with power consumption, energy use, income per person closely tied. Right, and the point is that, we're only looking at pairwise relationships, but you can build them, once you have pairwise relationships, you can use various clustering techniques to try and get a bigger level picture. And we were sort of interested to see in this bigger level picture how things came out. And they came out to us what looked like fairly natural plays, right, in terms of energy expenditure and so on. If I can get it to run. This is sort of a separate project, but it's the visualization tool in action. And what's going on here is you're sort of throwing in new dimensions or new edges one at a time, and it's building sort of what we call this sort of gravity graph, where it tries to position them according to the strength of the relationship. Stronger relationships are sort of attracting each other more strongly, and it's trying to come up with sort of consistent position for all the items. This is a technique that's, again, it's being used in other contexts. This is our visualization, but you can see once you have this visualization, you can see things that I was talking about before, mortality rate, sort of connecting with live births, per capita expenditure on health, related to income per person, related to gross national product, and so on. And so to us, it seems like the clusters are actually fairly meaningful and are really sort of able to capture higher level structure relationships once you get the pairwise relationships down the graph. Okay. So that ends the talk. There are lots and lots of people involved in the project. There was like every of us, 9 of us on the paper, and a lot of people who helped or gave advice or suggestions or other sorts of things on the way. So I'd like to thank my co-authors, in particular the ones who helped develop these nice slides, which hopefully made me look good, and otherwise it's their fault if they did. And I'd be happy to take questions about this or anything else while I'm here.
The gridding technique tends to bother me because as your data set size grows, you get more and more outliers, and then suddenly you start filling in these points. So that it seems that the technique is really sensitive to data set size.
No, well, so outliers are sort of easily, I mean, they'll fall into some box, but they just don't affect the mutual information.
Yeah,
so that's not good.
You showed like black and white squares. You count how many delegates?
Yes, you count how many.
Use the count.
Use the count.
You didn't mention that.
Oh, sorry. They were shaded differently to try to represent ways. It's the count, the mutual information is based on the count of the number of points that fall into each box. Yeah.
You mentioned categorical data at the beginning, but I didn't see any examples of that. Is there a special way to set up the MIC?
Or, I'm not sure, I might have tried to avoid mentioning categorical data. I mean, so categorical data, and sometimes what you have to do is try and map it into, a two-dimensional grid shape. Really this is a rank-based statistic. So, in some sense, it shouldn't matter so much, how you map them out onto the axis. But, the issues with categorical data is that they're going to be sort of vertical or lined up. So you might have to introduce some noise or do some other things to make it reasonably well.
Did you try any data sets with categorical data?
No, I mean, we've been primarily focused on.
Can you try to explain the computational complexity of MIC versus, like, say, Pearson coefficient? Like, say, how much more computation power you require?
So the first question is, what's the cost of finding an optimal grid? And as a computer scientist, I'm bothered to tell you that I don't know. Right? I believe that it's actually an NP-hard problem to find an optimal grid. There's lots of similar partitioning problems that are NP-hard. So it just seems natural to me that this is itself an NP-hard problem. The problem with proving it's NP-hard is mutual information is just such a difficult quantity to work with that I don't see an easy way to translate other partitioning proofs into this. So that's a great open problem that I'd love to think about with anyone. So what we end up doing, of course, is just trying to approximate it. Right? So we have a dynamic programming-based approximation algorithm that you can parameterize in various ways to get speed up. And it works reasonably well. I mean, we're handling these data sets with 60,000 relationships and some reasonable number of hours using lots of machines and parallelizing it. To us, we were sort of leaving that as a question. It's sort of like, in our paper, we present, here's how we approximate MIC. It seems to be a good approximation, and it seems to be fast. But that's certainly an area where there's a lot more that could be done, theoretically, in terms of coming up with algorithms with specific guarantees, or more efficient.
But one of the things this is a comment, not a question. One of the things that jumped out at me is that since M and N are bounded, you can just spawn off n times n processes on different machines.
Absolutely, that's absolutely. It does have the nice parallelization effect that exactly you just say, okay, each machine handles a grid and go. Yeah.
Is there any way of finding associations in the presence of confounders? Like, can we, like in correlation, we have partial correlations. Can we use this method in those cases?
So possibly and probably in some cases, right? Again, that was sort of the, you can think of the gut examples as being sort of an example of that, right? Where we saw that there were these sort of, this relationship where one was high and the other was low, and there was some other variable that was affecting both of them. And the point was we didn't know what that variable was, but we could still see that relationship. And that's what I'm saying. Then you have to go back and look at the data and try and figure out what the confounding variable might be. But this sort of gives you the right sense of, here's an interesting relationship, where I ought to be looking for something like that.
When you were talking about overfitting and underfitting, you mentioned like to correct that, you can use this like bounding parameter. Do you set it like by eye or there's some?
No, I mean, so what we found experimentally is that 0.6 tends to be like a good parameter. It's another place where it's like we expect there to be more done in the theory for someone to come up with good reasons why you should pick something in the 0.6 to 0.7 range. But again, we sort of view this as a first paper. We expect there'll be plenty of follow-on work with people making improvements or filling in places that we can justify theoretically, or just trying to blast us and say that we didn't know what we were talking about when we did too.
So I think there one could view that problem as a model selection problem, and usually most model selection algorithms work by adding a penalty. So if you have a final grade, you have a penalty which is heavy. So only if you can fit very well, just the penalty compensate for this grade. So there's a trade-off between fit and penalty. If the sharper the fit, the heavier the penalty is. And so it's a clear model selection.
Yeah, that would certainly be a framework that you could look at.
Yeah.